"Ma'am, the Family Services Center is 2 buildings down on the right," he said, his voice loud enough to carry over the rumble of passing trucks. "I think the bake sale is starting soon." Mildred Hughes didn't move. She stood on the sun-baked asphalt, a woman whose age was etched into the fine lines around her eyes but contradicted by the unyielding straightness of her spine. Her long silver hair was pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a royal blue tweed jacket, an odd choice for the humid North Carolina air, with the sleeves rolled up to her forearms. She held a simple, unadorned leather handbag in one hand and met the Lance Corporal's gaze with an expression of placid neutrality. "I'm not here for a bake sale, son," she said. Her voice was quiet, a low and steady murmur that seemed to absorb the ambient noise rather than compete with it. Lance Corporal Davis's helpful smile tightened into a smirk. He exchanged a quick, knowing look with his partner, a PFC who was trying very hard to look busy checking the ID of a driver in the adjacent lane. "Okay, well, if you're visiting someone, you'll need a sponsor to come on base and get you a pass. Who are you here to see? Your husband? Your son? Your son?" "I have an appointment," Mildred stated again, her voice betraying no hint of frustration. She extended her hand, not with a driver's license but with an old laminated card. It was a military identification card, but one from a bygone era. The photo showed a much younger woman with the same steady eyes, her hair short and dark, her face unlined. The lettering was faded, the corners soft from decades of wear. Davis took it from her reluctantly, as if touching a museum artifact. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. "Ma'am, this thing expired before I was born. We can't accept this." He tried to hand it back. "It's a retiree ID. It doesn't expire," Mildred said, her hand remaining at her side. "All IDs have to be scannable in the DBID system now," he retorted, his tone dripping with the condescension of a teenager explaining a smartphone to a grandparent. He gestured to the scanner on his pedestal. "See this? No chip, no scan, no entry. That's the rule." It was as she held her arm out waiting for him to return her card that his eyes fell to her forearm, exposed by the rolled-up sleeve of her jacket. There, on the weathered skin just below her elbow, was a tattoo. It was old, the black ink faded to a hazy blue-green, the lines blurred by time. It wasn't a rose or a name in a heart. It was a serpent coiled tightly around a shape that looked like an old-fashioned radio key, the kind used for Morse code. From the serpent's head, a single forked tongue flickered out, almost touching a stylized human ear. Davis squinted at it, then let out a short, derisive laugh. "Whoa, check it out, Miller," he called to his partner. The PFC glanced over. "Grandma's got some ink. What's that supposed to be? You in a biker gang back in the day?" PFC Miller snickered. "Maybe it's a snake charming club, Davis." Mildred's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to recede, looking past the young men in front of her, past the concrete barriers and the American flag snapping in the wind. She said nothing. Her silence was a strange, heavy thing. It was not the silence of submission or confusion. It was the silence of a mountain, content to let the wind howl around it, knowing the wind would eventually tire. This unnerved Davis more than any argument could have. He wanted a reaction, anger, tears, frustration. He wanted her to conform to the box he had already put her in, a confused old lady, a lost spouse, a harmless nuisance. Her quiet dignity was a challenge to his authority, and he doubled down. "Look, ma'am," he said, his voice hardening, "I don't have time for this. I have a line of actual military personnel trying to get to work. You either have a sponsor, or you have a valid, scannable ID. This piece of history," he flicked the old card with his fingernail, "is not going to get you on my base." He spoke the words "my base" with a fierce, unearned pride of ownership. He was the gatekeeper, the guardian. In his mind, he was protecting the installation from an elderly woman in a tweed jacket. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Main gate to PMO. Got a civilian here. Female, elderly, attempting to gain access with an invalid ID, refusing to cooperate." The radio crackled back a bored voice, likely a sergeant sitting in an air-conditioned office. "Davis, you know the procedure. No valid ID, no entry. Tell her to wait at the visitor's center and call her sponsor. If she won't leave, have her escorted." The validation from a superior puffed Davis up. He stood even straighter. "You heard him, ma'am. You need to step aside. Now, we can either do this the easy way, or I can call the MPs to come have a chat with you." Still, she just watched him. Her gaze was steady, her breathing even. It was in that moment, as Davis puffed out his chest and Miller shuffled his feet, that Mildred's eyes flickered down to the faded serpent on her arm. The jeering words of the young Marine seemed to fade into a different kind of noise. The humid Carolina air was suddenly thick with the memory of a different heat, a suffocating wet wool blanket of heat that smelled of rot and cordite and fear. The ink on her arm, mocked as a relic of a biker gang, suddenly felt warm against her skin. She wasn't seeing a gate at Camp Lejeune. She was seeing the red mud of a bunker wall in Quezon, hearing the frantic clatter of a radio key under her own fingers, the hiss of static a constant companion. She could almost feel the phantom sting of the bamboo needle and the crude ink, a pact sealed in blood and sweat in a place where tomorrow was a luxury. The line of cars waiting to enter the base was now backed up past the last checkpoint. Horns began to honk intermittently. In a dusty sedan 3 cars back, a woman in a crisp service uniform sat drumming her fingers on the steering wheel. Captain Eva Rostova, an intelligence officer on her way to a morning brief, leaned forward, trying to see the source of the holdup. She saw the 2 junior Marines and the old woman. She sighed, another visitor confused about the procedures. But something about the woman's posture held her attention. It was a stillness she recognized. It wasn't the rigid attention of a parade formation, but the preternatural calm of someone who has spent a lifetime mastering their own internal state in the face of external chaos. Rostova had seen it in old photographs of legends, in the eyes of grizzled instructors at Quantico. Then the old woman shifted her weight, and the morning sun caught the tattoo on her forearm. Rostova went cold, her breath hitched in her throat. She fumbled for the binoculars she kept in her glove compartment, her hands suddenly clumsy. She raised them to her eyes, twisting the focus wheel with a frantic energy. The image snapped into clarity. The faded blue-green ink, the serpent, the radio key, the ear. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a symbol, a ghost. It was the unofficial insignia of a unit that, according to most official histories, never had any women in it. A unit that operated in the shadows of the Vietnam War, whose records were sealed, redacted, or burned. MAC-VSOG. Studies and Observations Group. Specifically, the signals intelligence teams that went by the call sign, the Serpent's Ear, radio operators who worked in the most dangerous forward-operating locations, listening to the enemy's whispers, their intelligence, the only thing standing between a Marine patrol and a deadly ambush. She'd spent months in the archives, piecing together fragments of declassified reports. She knew that symbol. It was whispered about, a legend among intel historians. And it was never, ever supposed to be on the arm of a woman. The Lance Corporal was now making a show of directing traffic around Mildred, treating her like a piece of debris in the road. He was gesturing for her to move to a concrete barrier out of the way, his face a mask of smug righteousness. Rostova's training, her instincts, her very soul as a Marine officer screamed at her. She dropped the binoculars and grabbed her phone. She didn't call the Provost Marshal's office. She didn't call the gate sergeant. She scrolled through her contacts to a number she rarely used. The direct line to the office of the base commander. Her call was picked up by a stern-sounding Master Gunnery Sergeant. Colonel Jennings' office. Master Guns, this is Captain Rostova. I need to speak with the Colonel. It's an emergency. The Colonel is preparing for a brief with IIMEF Captain. Can it wait? No, Master Gunnery Sergeant. It cannot, Rostova said, her voice tight with an urgency that cut through the protocol. There is a woman at the main gate, an elderly woman. The gate guards are about to have her removed. You need to tell the Colonel, tell him it's about the Serpent's Ear. There was a pause on the other end of the line. And tell him the name on her ID might be Hughes. Mildred Hughes. Inside the sprawling headquarters building, Colonel Sam Jennings was reviewing a presentation on force readiness when his office door opened without a knock. His sergeant major, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, stood in the doorway holding a phone. Sir, you need to hear this. Jennings took the phone. He listened to Captain Rostova's clipped, urgent report. As she spoke, the sergeant major was already on a computer, his thick fingers flying across the keyboard with surprising speed. He was pulling up the deep archives, the files that required special clearance to access. The name Mildred Hughes populated on the screen. The file was flagged with so many security warnings it looked like a Christmas tree. He clicked through. What loaded was not a standard service record. It was a ghost file, a collection of commendations and after-action reports, most of them heavily redacted. But the citations were clear. Navy Cross. The text below it was stark. For extraordinary heroism while serving with Radio Intelligence Section Studies and Observations Group near the Quezon Combat Base. With her listening post about to be overrun, then Sergeant Hughes maintained radio contact, calling in precise artillery fire on her own position to halt the enemy advance, knowingly sacrificing her own safety to save the lives of the surrounded reconnaissance team she was supporting. The sergeant major's breath hissed through his teeth. God Almighty, he whispered so low the colonel couldn't hear. He kept scrolling. Bronze star with valor device, 2 purple hearts, a list of deployments that officially didn't exist. Her last enlisted rank, gunnery sergeant. Colonel Jennings hung up the phone. His face was pale. Sergeant Major, get the command vehicle. Get Captain Rostova on the horn, and tell her to meet us at the main gate. Now, move. Aye, sir, the Sergeant Major said, already grabbing the colonel's cover from its stand. As they strode out of the office, the Sergeant Major glanced back at the screen. At the bottom of the file was a faded, scanned photograph of a young woman with dark, serious eyes, standing beside a radio set in a sandbagged bunker. On her forearm, still fresh and dark, was the tattoo of a coiled serpent. It's her, he said to the empty room. It's Gunny Hughes. Back at the gate, Lance Corporal Davis had reached the end of his non-existent patience. The humiliation of the traffic jam, coupled with the old woman's infuriating calm, had pushed him over the edge. He saw her not as a person, but as a problem that was making him look bad. All right, that's it. I've given you every chance, he announced, stepping closer to her. He gestured to the tattoo on her arm. That ink. You know it's a federal offense to fraudulently wear military insignia, right? It's called stolen valor. Given your age, these credentials you're carrying are probably fake too. You probably don't even remember the current procedures because you've been out for so long. He was inches from her now, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate her. I'm detaining you on suspicion of fraudulent representation and trespassing. You are to come with me to the PMO station. Now, he reached out, his hand about to close around her arm, the very arm bearing the tattoo he had mocked. He never touched her. A sound cut through the air, not a loud siren, but the urgent chirping wail of a command vehicle's escort. Traffic that had been inching forward came to a dead stop. Marines in their cars craned their necks, their expressions of annoyance turning to ones of confusion and alarm. 2 black government SUVs, flanked by a military police cruiser with its lights flashing, sped down the wrong side of the road, bypassing the entire line of traffic. They screeched to a halt just yards from the pedestrian entrance. The doors flew open. Out stepped Colonel Sam Jennings, the silver eagle on his collar gleaming in the sun. Beside him was his Sergeant Major, his presence a physical weight of authority. And from the other side, Captain Eva Rostova emerged, her eyes locked on Mildred. Davis froze, his hand hovering in midair. His face went from flushed with anger to chalk white with terror. The base commander, here, at his gate. Colonel Jennings didn't even glance at Davis. His eyes and the eyes of his Sergeant Major were fixed on one person and one person only, the old woman in the blue tweed jacket. They strode forward, their boots crunching on the asphalt with a purpose that seemed to shake the very ground. Jennings stopped directly in front of Mildred Hughes. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to her forearm, to the faded serpent coiling around the radio key. His expression, which was usually a hard mask of command, softened into something that looked like pure, unadulterated awe. He took a sharp breath. His back went ramrod straight. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cover in the sharpest, most precise salute he had ever rendered in his 28 years of service. It was a salute of such profound respect that it seemed to pull the air from the lungs of everyone watching. Gunnery Sergeant Hughes. Colonel Jennings' voice boomed across the now silent gate plaza. It was a voice accustomed to commanding thousands, but it was filled with a deep, personal reverence. It is an absolute honor, ma'am. A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Davis looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Gunnery Sergeant? The colonel held his salute, his eyes locked on hers. Colonel Sam Jennings, ma'am. I'm the base commander. I apologize for the reception you've received. It is an inexcusable failure on our part. Mildred finally moved. She looked at the colonel, then at his Sergeant Major, who was also standing at rigid attention. A flicker of a smile, the first she had shown all morning, touched the corners of her lips. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the permission he needed. Jennings dropped his salute and turned, his face once again a mask of cold fury. He faced the assembled gate guards and the dozens of Marines now watching from their vehicles. For those of you who don't know your history, he began, his voice like cracking ice. You are standing in the presence of a living legend of our Corps. This is Gunnery Sergeant Mildred Hughes. In 1968, during the Tet Offensive, when the Khe-Sanh combat base was surrounded and under siege for 77 straight days, then Sergeant Hughes was a radio intelligence operator attached to MACV-SOG. He pointed a rigid finger toward Mildred. She volunteered for a forward listening post outside the wire, a post that was attacked and nearly overrun. Under direct enemy fire, with her position compromised, she refused to abandon her radio. She proceeded to call in artillery strikes on her own location, knowing full well it would mean her own death, to stop the NVA from breaking through our lines and slaughtering a Lost Force reconnaissance team. That action saved the lives of 17 Marines. For that, she was awarded the Navy Cross. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. The Navy Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Young Marines, men and women alike, stared at Mildred, their jaws slack. They were looking at a ghost from the history books, a woman who had been in the thick of one of the Corps' most brutal battles, at a time when women officially weren't anywhere near combat. She served when the gear was heavier, the enemy was closer, and the support was miles away. Jennings continued, his voice rising. She served at a time when women had to fight 10 times as hard just to be considered half as good. She kicked down doors so that officers like Captain Rostova, he gestured to Eva, and NCOs and junior Marines of today could walk through them. She is a part of the bedrock on which this modern Marine Corps is built. He finally turned his gaze to Lance Corporal Davis, and the full weight of his command authority descended on the young Marine. You are a disgrace, Lance Corporal. Not because you made a procedural error, but because you showed a complete and utter lack of the most fundamental quality of a Marine, judgment. You looked at this woman and you saw a frail, confused senior citizen. You failed to see the bearing. You failed to see the strength in her eyes. You looked at a piece of our Corps' sacred history on her arm and you mocked it. Davis was trembling, his eyes wide with fear and shame. Sir, I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't look. The sergeant major barked, his voice a gravelly roar. You didn't ask, you assumed. In our business, assumptions get people killed. Colonel Jennings stepped forward again, lowering his voice so only the gate guards could hear. You and your NCO will report to my sergeant major tomorrow morning at 0500. You are going to learn every single thing there is to know about the history of women in this Corps, going all the way back to Opha May Johnson. You're going to write a report on it. And then you are going to deliver a presentation on it to every Marine in your company. Is that understood? Yes, sir, Davis whispered, his voice cracking. Mildred stepped forward then, her movement slow and deliberate. The colonel and sergeant major immediately fell silent. She looked at the terrified young Marine. Her face was not angry. It was patient. The face of a gunnery sergeant who had seen countless young, foolish Marines and knew that they were not lost causes but works in progress. The uniform changes, Colonel, she said, her quiet voice cutting through the tension. The haircut changes. The technology certainly changes. But the standard is the standard. You don't look at the wrinkles. You look for the bearing. You don't listen to the pitch of the voice. You listen for the tone of authority. She looked directly at Davis. Don't soften the standards. Ever. But learn to apply them fairly. To everyone. Experience doesn't expire when you get gray hair. Sometimes that's when it's finally been perfected. As she spoke, the image of the faded tattoo on her arm seemed to sharpen in the minds of those watching. For a fleeting moment the scene shifted. It was no longer a sunny morning at Camp Lejeune. It was a dark, suffocatingly hot night in a bunker. A young Mildred, her face smeared with mud and fatigue, sat hunched over a radio set. A wounded Marine, his arm in a sling, was carefully etching the serpent onto her arm with a sterilized needle and ink made from gunpowder and pen fluid. You're one of us now, Gunny, he had rasped, his voice weak but firm. Forever, you hear the serpent's whispers for us. It was not a decoration. It was a covenant. A mark of belonging earned in the crucible of combat. A week later, Mildred Hughes was in the base library, tracing her finger over the spines of history books. She had her appointment, which was to donate a collection of old hand-drawn maps of Vietnam to the base archives. A figure appeared at the end of the aisle, standing hesitantly. It was the young man from the gate, no longer Lance Corporal Davis, but just Davis. He was in civilian clothes. He looked smaller without his uniform, younger. He approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Ma'am, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Gunnery Sergeant Hughes. Mildred turned, her expression unreadable. I needed to apologize, he stammered. What I did was, there's no excuse. It was disrespectful and ignorant. I was wrong. I'm sorry. The words tumbled out, earnest and raw. Mildred studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Apology accepted, son. He looked up, surprised by the simplicity of it. That's it. What else would there be, she asked. You made a mistake. You were corrected. The important part is what you do now. Where Sergeant Major has us studying, he said. I read about you, about all of it. I had no idea. Few people do, Mildred said, a hint of weariness in her voice. She pulled a book from the shelf. It was a thick volume on military leadership. Let me tell you a quick story. Long time ago, I had a new radio man. Kid from a farm in Iowa. Looked like he wouldn't hurt a fly. I assumed he'd break the first time things got loud. I almost had him transferred to the rear. She paused, looking at the book in her hands. A week later, we got hit. Hard. My primary radio went down. While everyone else was diving for cover, that kid, the farm boy, he crawled across 50 yards of open ground under machine gun fire, carrying a spare battery that weighed almost as much as he did. He got the radio working. He saved us. She looked back at Davis, her eyes clear and sharp. I judged a book by its cover. I was wrong. It was one of the most important lessons I ever learned. Never assume you know what a person is capable of, for good or for ill, just by looking at them. She handed him the book. The learning never stops, young man. Not for you, not for me. Davis took the book, his hands trembling slightly. Thank you, Gunny, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Mildred simply nodded and turned back to the shelves, her search for history continuing. The story of Gunnery Sergeant Mildred Hughes is a powerful reminder that heroes walk among us, often unseen, their valor hidden beneath the quiet dignity of age. They are the giants whose shoulders we all stand upon. If you believe in honoring the quiet courage and trailblazing spirit of veterans like her, like this video, subscribe to She Chose Valor, and share her story to ensure that these legends are never forgotten.